complicated, you know, man. It's like a dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, JD, welcome back to the show. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Mr. Burden.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. You and I spoke a while ago. I know this show hasn't been around for that long, but both of your appearances were relatively early in the catalog. So I'm glad to have you back on.
Yeah, happy to be here. That was it feels like yesterday, but we've definitely had a lot of growth since then in our separate endeavors here.
Yeah, really, right? In multiple ways. So obviously, as I've mentioned before, you are the owner of Axios Fitness, my sponsor, but you and I are also friends. And so we're going to talk about Axios a little bit, but I actually wanted to have you on to discuss something completely separate. So, you've mentioned before that, you're a businessman, you started your own kind of operation and done that specifically as a business, or as a dissident rather. And so I'm curious, like, what was that thought process of you deciding to strike out on your own?
Yeah, for me, and I think many people in my similar circumstance, I came from a specific industry or market. Like for me, I came from the health and fitness market, and you get to a point where you're playing within a specific game and you realize that the people that are offering you incentives don't necessarily have your best benefit at heart. The best they can hand you is a paycheck, and they can continually hope that you keep returning for that same incentive. And you know that your services need to go to people that trust you, support you, and people that you trust and support back. So it's pretty easy once you wrap your mind around knowing that you want to provide something that's for a stronger benefit. And I try and slow my presentation down because I don't want to come across as if I'm advocating that you need to be an activist in any way, but simply being intentional with what your services do. And so I decided to start my own, effectively, health and fitness consultation company, which has slowly grown into a individualized and group-based strength conditioning, basically program distribution center. And from there, I leaned into what I felt was the honest and authentic expression of what this service was supposed to do, and found a market of people that I wanted to sustain and provide my services to.
So yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious, right? Like, what is just because it does sort of seem like the incentives are set up to not to benefit you, right? I know you mentioned that in your talk. So what specifically are those type of, incentives that you felt like you were kind of pushing against?
Well, you can look at it a few different ways. One of which is kind of that HR creep, that ideological pressure to conform to that managerial mindset. Because that for many companies, when they get to a specific size, it leans itself into that, because that's how they find a sense of mass scale, mass growth, and mass consumer markets. So you actually have to denature whatever the initial intent was behind whatever that service you were providing. In my case, it's something that's like very specific. So the more that you denature it, the more that you can tell something's afoot. It's probably not the case for someone that works as an accountant somewhere, but when you work within a coaching or a high social trust service like mine, within the regards of health and coaching one-on-one, those intrusions from that ideological standpoint, they really just they begin to rob everything about what you'd want to do to begin with.
Well, I've definitely seen something, similar in the sense that, every year, right, if you work anywhere in the financial services, you have to go through compliance. And compliance is both legal and social, although you could make the argument that that's legal as well, right? And it's this sort of, and people make fun of Moldbug for any number of reasons, but his concept of the German cat is a really interesting one, where it's like, he uses this example of a magazine about animal husbandry, during the rise of the Third Reich, and in the very early years, it is essentially a normal magazine, right, that just happens to be published in German. And the very last issue, right, when eventually the printing press was destroyed by bombs, the type was set to talk about what it meant to be an Aryan cat, to be a German cat, right? And the idea is that even something that innocuous has been fully, ideologically captured. And I think that, you sort of have this realization that unless you build your own thing, everything is ideologically captured, any business, any institution. And so if you're looking to even have a chance at breaking away from that, it sort of requires you to either join one of the very few institutions not touched by it, or to kind of make something of yourself, out of nothing almost.
No, yeah, that's absolutely on point. And, dealing with that, you could be in a position where it hasn't happened yet, but the key word there is the yet. There's always going to be some form of it reaching in, and, within my case, I decided that it was time that I needed to have something that I could stand on my own 2 feet with, that I had some form of, I could be my own vanguard in a sense. And, leaning into the entrepreneurial side is something I'd strongly recommend for people that if you find yourself in a position where it feels like you're completely surrounded, leveraging whatever skills, talents, and abilities you have to basically start turning it into its own entity that you can start sharing with people and hopefully start, supplementing your life with in some way.
Well, definitely. And I think that it's been something that I've been watching, is the development of, and obviously there are specific organizations designed to foster this, right? There's New Founding, there's, the Exit Group. And so this isn't a problem that, you and I aren't the only people seeing this issue, right? That this kind of like creeping managerialism, the way in which, society has kind of devolved, has created this weird misallocation of resources where there are people, many of whom are likely listening to this, who are competent, right? Who in, an ordinary time would be very plugged into the system. Like you can imagine, right? Like if you're a successful local businessman, you have a lot invested, right, in the success of, the political system. You want your country to do well. But many of those people, and I would maybe put us in that same category, sort of feel like we can't thrive. Like the system, we're in a zero-sum game, that either the system wins and I lose, or vice versa. And so, there's a mass number of people who sort of feel this pressure to get out. And you've said that it's not it's not if, it's when. And, just recently I had Dan Baltic on to discuss Nutcranker, which is obviously it's a satirical book. It's funny. It's kind of poking fun of the internet poster. But the moment, where he's sort of revealed, he's brought before HR, and made unhireable, is a moment that I think lives in a lot of our a lot of our nightmares, right? That,
right, yeah.
Your beliefs have sort of been weaponized against you. And obviously I'm not saying that you should, be afraid of what you believe, but it is definitely something to consider.
Yeah, and if you do find yourself in that position, at least have some good posts so they read out your best hits.
Don't be posting coal. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In the HR. So I'm curious, right? One of the things that I won't say exactly where, but you've said that you're in kind of you're deep behind enemy lines, right?
Yeah,
you're not in a ideologically permissive zone, like perhaps I am.
Right. My yard sign isn't correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In this house, we believe, right? One of those neighborhoods. And so is there a part of that has also kind of affected, your decision to kind of strike out on your own?
Oh, I mean, absolutely. It's one more piece of the puzzle in the sense of, just trying to find something that doesn't have that in the background and doesn't have that as the cultural waters that you'd be swimming in, right? I mean, you mentioned Exit earlier. Exit Group is a fantastic opportunity to effectively start participating in something that is a conversation zone that you would not find organically, unfortunately. And that's kind of the piece, is that you're realizing that the organic territory around you is, it's probably just in my case, being in such a deep ideological void where I'm at, is that the chances for that organic conversation to emerge is extremely rare, extremely. And so finding the opportunities where you can kind of put out a signal where, you know, if someone found your service, you're at least talking on presuppositions that are in line with your presuppositions. And I've had that. I have normie customers, to put it mildly, but the way that you market and the way that you brand your business, if you understand the dissident side, you can actually stand out amazingly well and speak to a narrative that many people haven't heard, and they find it very attractive because it's lining up with their intuitions very, very well.
And I think that it's interesting you bring that up, because it's been something that I've sort of noticed before, where, and I don't perhaps do as good of a job as you do just by nature of what I do, but I will, with somewhat regularity, either get a comment or an email or a direct message with someone asking me something where I'm like, how did you end up here? Right? Like, how did you, either not knowing what that means or not being aware of that, like, how did you end up all the way down this rabbit hole? But what I think it is, after having it happen a couple times, is that, we're speaking to something real. We're speaking to something that a lot of people kind of instinctually feel. They just may not have, the language for it, or necessarily like the ideas explicitly expressed. But, if you can kind of put yourself out there in a way that admittedly kind of limits exposure, right? I'm not saying that, you do something imprudent, but you'd be surprised, and especially in an area like mine, which is more friendly. There's a lot more people who are willing to hear you out or willing to associate with you than you might think. And so I think that's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah, there's a natural repulsion to the current thing, for lack of a better term, because it's always going to be a new current thing. And there's a genuine wanting to distance from it for a lot of people. And they either consciously or unconsciously know that they can't talk about it. They can't talk about the repulsion to this thing, these ideas. And inevitably, like, kind of the way to describe us as dissidents is that we understand the conclusions, and everybody else is participating in something where they don't quite understand where it's going. And our enemies also understand the conclusions. They just want the conclusions. And so, yeah, go for it.
No, sorry. I didn't realize you were carrying on.
Yeah. And so if you can put together a branding message that kind of encapsulates that, or at least alludes to it in a kind of like hindbrain sense, you'll find a lot of people very attracted to your message or your product or your service, because it will stand out. Because we are oversaturated right now with that corporate Memphis style approach and the HR longhouse lady, like care at all cost type mantra.
Well, it was interesting. I went out last night for some beers with one of our guys, right, who lives in my area. And we were talking about this, just kind of astounded at the amount of cultural cachet that progressives have burnt and how quickly they burnt through it. When you think of, and maybe this is interesting as we're kind of gearing up for the Middle East round 3, the cultural attitude is completely different. That when you look at, kind of my early political memories, the kind of anti-Bush era, and all the triumphalism about that, and how essentially all culture and all interesting, quote unquote, all kind of cool culture was politically progressive in lockstep against, the neocons. And you look at now and, like, don't get me wrong, they have cultural dominance. But at the same time, right, who looks at them, and you've mentioned, corporate Memphis, right? Who looks at their fruit and basically says, like, yes, that's interesting. I want to be a part of that. And I hate to say it, but I think that a large part of the reason that dissident movements, ours included, are growing is just the fact that these people they've sort of revealed themselves incapable of ruling, incapable of creating culture. And even in a small way, right? Because they have set themselves up against even something as simple as like health and aesthetics, like good looking people who are active, who are doing well for themselves. That, yeah, okay, that maybe works with your core demographic of, like the underclass, right? Like spiteful mutants. But with normal people, that's repulsive, and I think rightfully so. And so I definitely think that, that's it's a win. That's an advantage to us.
Yeah. And there's an interesting kind of mental framing that I think we can't lose sight of, is that we may be dissident now, but there's, in a healthy and sane world, we shouldn't be the dissidents. We're actually, not to overuse the term that's been thrown around, but we are like trying to regain the sensible center, for lack of a better like heuristic to kind of understand why we're even here, is that through that just bonfire of cultural cachet that they've basically cast out a whole swath of genuine competency that's looking for something. And now we're at this point where we need to start piecing things together and using our competency, granted with a lot less resources than what would have been available to us in an earlier time, but we still need to do it. There's an underlying need that we start taking action and leveraging that competency for things that are sustaining. Because if you attach yourself to that, egalitarian global corp style, that world, and let yourself get passive and numb, you're going to find yourself at a point where you basically can't exit because you're going to be too connected to the system. So your best moves now are to basically start. If you have an idea, now is the time to start. And the only better time was yesterday.
Well, it's interesting you bring up that lack of resources, because that's something that I think about a lot. And, it's very easy to kind of bemoan your lack of resources, like, societal, cultural, social, compared to one or two generations ago. And fair enough, right?
Mm-hmm. But
I think there's also something to be said for the fact that the amount of resources they had were not historically normal. That was a time of kind of of unknown plenty, right? Like that was a very, very rare time to be alive. And in a sense, we're sort of returning to historical norms. And, obviously cyclical history is kind of in these circles right now. Everyone's talking about it. I've got my copy of Prophets of Doom on my desk, unwritten or unread, like perhaps, some people in the audience do as well. But there is something to that idea that, the decadence, the surplus that our ancestors had created the situation that we're in now. And so you can say like, look, like, I wish I was born in a time that was different. I wish I was born, maybe in the front end instead of the back end of the good times. But I do think there's something about that where it's like, look, like it's the deck you've been given. It's the hand you've been given, rather. And it's not impossible to build something. It's not impossible to make something for yourself. And I think that avenue is still open, and like you said, it's like, well, do it, if you can, it's sort of the best chance you've got.
Yeah. And let me amend an earlier comment. I may have said lack of resources, but really there still are plenty of resources available. There are. People are looking to spend money on the thing that you can provide if you do it in a way that's honest and genuine. And don't just do it in a way that is, a blatant counter signal. But we can, as you said, there was the decadence of early eras that kind of set up a false mindset of plenty, because you're sitting on so many easy resources that it's a bit, I don't know, a bit of a false current. It made winning seem too obvious and easy. Whereas now you're much closer to, as you said, you're much closer to like kind of a correction to the norm. And your successes will still emerge, but they're going to be much more tied to the feedback loop of you leveraging your skills and finding a way to correct your errors and, generally not have to, get away with mistakes you don't learn from.
Yeah. And I think that, getting away from that idea of sort of, I don't know, getting away from the consequences of your mistakes is something that I think about a lot. Again, like I said, I was, out the other night, meeting with a friend, and he is, like many of us here, kind of came through the libertarian sphere, and he was talking about, the libertarians in economics. And I sort of think that they're, from a certain perspective, that they're right. That economics is sort of the first place that we learned we could sort of cheat. That we could violate the kind of like baseline rules and it would work. The assumption was, well, it'll work forever. I would, on a long enough time frame, probably ultimately disagree. But it was sort of that, it was like putting, like dry leaves on a fire, right? You could get it up really high, really quickly. And I think that what we're sort of seeing in all of this is like, wait, the freedom from consequences that our, our ancestors and those, in kind of last couple of generations enjoyed, like that was artificial. They were sitting on this immense amount of, seed corn, essentially, like this immense amount of stored up wealth, from, 1,000 years before them. And that enabled them to do great things, to conquer the world, to go to space, all of these things. But at the same time, using it at a cost. And I think that you're right. It is sort of like a situation in which like we have to play a little bit more cautiously because we don't have that same safety net. I mean, in many cases, literally, right? Like the economic woes of our generations respectively. Like there's a whole bunch of articles on that, right? Where it's like something like, I think like 80% of Gen Z assumes they'll never own a home. But the point is, right? Like there is, like, I don't want to make light of that lack of backing. That's not a good thing that it's gone, is all I want to say.
Yeah, no, that's a solid point. We're in a position now where we can't get away with having illusions. We have to be as close to reality as we can be.
Right. And so I'm curious, right? When you kind of started out, with your own thing, is this, your own business? Was this something that you had kind of been wanting to do for a while, or was there some kind of like catalyzing moment?
The idea had existed for a while, but I can't quite say that there was a catalyzing moment other than I finally kind of worked up the courage and said, okay, what does it take to start? And how do I start getting those pieces in play? And then set my, roughly you're looking at like 5-yard targets. For me personally, that's kind of how it started, was aim for small targets early and generate some wins, and then slowly, just capture that momentum and find ways to grow in a way that is sustainable to everything else that your life has going on.
So one of the things that I think is sort of interesting in all of this is that from a certain perspective, right, the internet is the devil. It's the thing that's sort of making us all go insane, spreading all of these, like social and moral contagions. But on the other end, it's sort of the only thing that allows us to exist. When I mean us, I mean kind of like dissident right-wing communities. And I think that in the same way, right, because your business is, mediated by the internet, it sort of offers an escape from, your kind of immediate local area. Because, when you are in a heavily blue area, if you're limited to what, to what's actually around you, you do sort of have to kind of mesh with that like local religion more. And so I wonder, do you have any kind of perspective on that? On one hand, kind of balancing the corrosive nature of the internet and social media with also kind of using it as a way out almost.
Yeah, you have to really temper your use of it. It's as destructive as everyone claims it is. But the opportunity that exists for you to express, the ability to be creative is, incredibly, powerful for someone in a new entrepreneurial position, because you have far more resources kind of existing within that internet space that are trying to be a tool to help you build something. So the infrastructure that you can build leveraging the internet is, amazingly powerful. You just have to make sure you don't get captured by it. Which, I mean, I don't necessarily have a solution for everyone. I mean, we're gonna be on the internet for a long time. It's how we're gonna share our ideas. It's how we're gonna communicate. So that is a little bit of a bargain with, you know, the best way to probably frame it is it's a Promethean fire, right? We can do amazing things with it, but also if we don't control ourselves, we'll allow ourselves to just be consumed by it and too reliant on it. So in my own case, I still operate with some one-on-one personal in the meat space type coaching. My garage is effectively my training facility, and you know, within it, I can interact with people on the local level, and no matter how touched they are kind of by the surrounding cultural element, my service and what we do within health and fitness is so intrinsically our thing, because you have to be contending with reality to, you know, for 200 pounds to be 200 pounds, you can't just redefine it. So that's my personal answer to how you can stay grounded, is have an aspect of what you do that requires that social element, that interacting with humans, social side, because the soft skills are going to become such a premium in the coming future, because so many of them are fading away and being, you know, people think that they can automate that human element, which isn't going to be the case when it comes to finding people that you want to cooperate and do business with.
So you brought something up, which I think is an interesting like vein of discussion, right? Which is that kind of correlation between, you know, physical fitness and, I guess, relationship to reality. And one of the things that I've been kind of passively watching, I think is really interesting, is this development of, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's an injectable weight loss drug. Let me look it up. It's like Ozempic.
Ozempic, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's what it is. Because it's been kind of touted as this, you know, this sort of miracle drug, right? And I promise this does relate to what I brought up before. You know, that's like, oh, you can eat whatever you want. You know, you can just, you know, have this treatment and the pounds will melt off, right? And so that comes out. That seems a little bit, you know, unbelievable. And then first you just see what people who are on this drug look like, and they look horrifying. They look like, I mean, how would you describe it, JD? They look like, I don't, like corpses.
Yeah,
You know,
well,
just,
it's an injectable anorexia is the best way to describe it. You can put an eating disorder right into your body.
right. And that's exactly what it looks like. You know, it's this like ghoul of a person. And you see that, and just on an instinctual level, you're like, well, I don't know why, you know, that's bad, but that's bad, you know, just on the like instinctual level. But then all of these sort of, you know, second tier studies start to come out, you know, once it sort of hit the commercial market. And it's like, wait a minute, this isn't good for your brain. You know, this isn't good for your tendon. This isn't good for any part of you really at all. And because again, right, it's again, this sort of way to opt out of reality, you know, and we sort of see the depths to which people will go to kind of avoid confronting, you know, like real physical reality, that like, oh, like you can't act a certain way and be healthy. You know, you're going to have to, you know, make a sacrifice, make a cut, you know, work harder, eat less. You know, we can defy it all, you know, with just one simple treatment. And so I do think that there's a reason that, you know, fitness and health and beauty are sort of being targeted, you know, in their most natural form, because at least so far you can't really fake it, you know, yet. You can get this kind of like awful synthetic version of it, you know, but it's not quite the real thing. You know, it's like at arm's distance, it looks like, oh, he's skinny. But then you sort of like look at the picture and you're like, oh, he looks like a corpse. You know, he's already dead. And so do you kind of see what I'm getting at there?
Oh no, absolutely. Yeah, this is a big piece of, I would say this is a big piece of how I try and market my service as a solution. Is you're going to be, for a tale as old as time, is that people are trying to offer shortcuts towards something that requires that physical sacrifice and the personal discipline to try and achieve something. And when it's authentically achieved, the results are, they're visual in terms of what you begin to express, like all the way down to your posture, to how you communicate with people. They all change because of interacting with an obstacle and overcoming it in an authentic way. And then what you're seeing time and time again with these modern solutions to age-old problems is this desired shortcut approach to try and the biggest problem in the way that they frame it is that there's work that needs to be done. And here's a way to get around that. Here's a way to not have to change your comfortable, cushy, relaxed way of life. And this will fit right in so that you can keep chasing the next pleasure after pleasure that we're going to sell you. And, the results are obvious. And all the way down to, as you said, the physical expression of what does it look like when you try and cheat the system, when you try and cheat biology. It shows itself as, effectively you look mutated, you look unnatural in that sense. And the clown show is just not going to stop in that regard. And yeah, go for it.
Well, you sort of see it with cosmetic surgery as well, right? Like, look, like we've all seen an old person, and it might not be like desirable to look like that, but it's not, repulsive. It's how people look when you get old. It sort of happens, But then you see, and I think that the best example to this is someone like Madonna, who's essentially like almost completely synthetic at this point, and looks like some sort of like cat demon.
Yeah, they become the demon that's haunting them. Right.
Yeah, and there's something to that that's kind of, I don't know, darkly fascinating. That there's this, culture. There's this kind of like cultural idea, this meme, whether it's like Faust or the monkey's paw, where you sort of get what you want, but not how you thought, and that sort of deal with the devil, to get eternal youth, to stay looking young, quote unquote, young forever. And all it does is produce these kind of like twisted monstrosities. And in addition to just the aesthetic level of it, right, it's like obvious that this is not a good way to live. The declining rate of, happiness, the increasingly young age at which people seek out, either like, dietary help or, cosmetic surgery, just as one example, right? It's very obvious that this isn't a healthful way for people to live. Now, look, like I don't believe like, certain kind of normal, quote unquote, conservatives do. They're like, oh, like everyone will wake up one day and see that this is bad and doesn't make sense. I don't see that happening. I see a lot of these people as being either like slaved to their, base instincts or just like in this kind of like religious fervor. But at the same time, there's something nice about, opposing people who are very clearly, running their own lives poorly. It's not like we're fighting like,
the enemy distinction becomes really clear from
exactly
from a physiological level.
Yeah. So I'm curious in that, what are your kind of, and I've realizing now I've said that one turn of phrase about 10 times in this podcast. So you'll have to forgive me. I get in mental ruts with phrases, but what do you think are kind of the approaching kind of like vectors for attack when it comes to health and fitness? Because obviously, there's been moves made against certain food. Like, I don't know if you've noticed, but progressives are really upset about raw milk now. Like they're like convinced that it's like a symbol of either like white supremacy or it will kill 100% of the people who drink it. I say as I'm finishing a coffee full of raw milk, right? So that's obviously one, there's a whole bunch of things on, meat or certain like non-plant-based diet, but where do you see that kind of debate going?
Well, as you pointed out, the food supply issue is certainly one that is an attack vector, and it's been one for a while. You can, look up, different histories of industrialized food and see that it's very clearly an avenue for kind of corporate government collusion and, manipulating the food supply for either the specific interests of a single food or a single food producer being what should be distributed, or, even more maliciously, basically lying about the health that follows from that food supply. And the raw milk one has been one that's been a slow roll for a while, definitely as effectively the dairy lobby has grown and grown in its power. The desire to shut down local access to, having your own food supply is very beneficial to a entity that wants to have a centralized monopoly over a high quality food source such as dairy. The next one that I would say that probably isn't being addressed too much is, if you've talked to anybody kind of in our sphere, you'll have heard the term xenoestrogens or endocrine disruptors that exist in different foodstuffs or different ingredients that end up in foodstuffs. A lot of your common processed foods that have to sit for extended times and have these very long shelf lives, they have to be filled with forms of preservatives that keep the food from spoiling, so you can not only sell them longer, but also kind of cut down on the margins of the cost of that food. So they get stocked with things that replicate estrogen once they enter into the body. And these are having some pretty severe downstream consequences on just the total health and well-being of, your average American diet. More so than just looking at the macronutrients, but looking at it from a standpoint of these substances that the people are eating are acting like a hormone, and they're causing hormonal-based damages that are altering how this body operates physiologically. Now, that's a problem in itself, but what's going to be coming down the road is effectively hormonal-based treatments that are going to be offered at younger and younger ages. And if you can see the parallels already to another current phenomenon, then you are paying attention, because there's a lot to be gained by having someone basically as a lifetime consumer of a pharmaceutical product for the rest of their lives, which seems to be the model that is being incentivized or lobbied for through these different elements. And then, to not deviate the topic too much, but if you are aware if you're aware of treatments like hormone replacement therapy for men, you'll see a ton of information on the benefits. And the benefits are there because the long-running damages of the endocrine disruptors in the food supply effectively is, leaving a whole generation of men with, 50% of the testosterone that they should have. And that has massive detrimental effects to their long-term health. So TRT becomes this amazing solution to kind of help remedy that. But in and of itself isn't a solution. It's another Band-Aid. And it's going to, all signs are pointing that it's going to be continued to be basically incentivized down further and further in the chain of how old is it acceptable to start giving someone hormones. And we're seeing, just to wrap up and I'll hand it over, we're obviously seeing that the conversation around children and hormones is already being had.
I like how you brought that up, because I've been thinking about this, kind of the system of addiction. Because when you look at sort of any major product or service that you interact with, it's oftentimes designed to be something that you sort of are stuck being kind of like slowly bled dry by, right? Whether that's a subscription or in kind of like the other ways that addiction is monetized, right? So very obviously, and you've brought up, medical treatment, that's one. But as well, right, when it comes to SSRIs or these kind of like mood altering, psychiatric drugs, which are basically not only addictive, but they essentially kind of like rewire your brain so you require these drugs to function. Again, much like other substances, that's another vector. But then also you have like, well, okay, what do kind of like cheap carbs and sugar do to you? Well, they become addictive, right? Like, I'm the first one to admit, like, I even probably am a little bit addicted to sugar, or, and kind of on the darker end of it, something like, internet porn, right? Where that is a literal monetization of addiction, right? My state very recently kind of adopted or re-legalized gambling, and it's the same thing, right? It's another way to keep you addicted, to keep you not only drained of your resources, but also, as we talk about, desiring to, break from the system. That's something that keeps you in, because you can't get your hormone injections, if you don't have health insurance. You can't get your fix if you don't have broadband internet. And in all of those ways, I think that especially it serves as a good tool to, one, reward kind of the lower end of the strata, right? People who wouldn't be going anywhere, but they get to have, the dopamine high of, whatever their addiction is. But on the other end, right, and I'm sure a lot of guys like this who are bright, who should be going someplace, but they're kind of crippled by, addiction, by substance, and specifically a lot of like high IQ, like motivate or, young men who should be motivated are essentially kneecapped by, substance or, like the internet or anything like that. And I think that it's sort of like a autoimmune response, of the system in a way.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've gotten to a point where there's not even what would it be? It's that the benefit of the thing isn't even being argued. It's just simply being expressed and saying should be made to help handle this desire. Effectively, that it's the confusion between benefit and desire. That's probably a better way to put it. Because the benefit of everything you just listed, like who benefits from lifetime injections? And their argument would be like, well, the person that needs the injection, they need this thing, and we're not even going to investigate the root cause. Just give them the thing. And so you're masking that root cause approach and masking kind of the, it gets into Uncle Ted territory pretty quick in regards to, the propensity for people to be sucked into by things is a natural result of the system itself.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up, that, kind of the framing of it, it's even gone past, like this is a good thing. And again, we've kind of talked about that HR, care at any cost, where in having, kind of like a civic religion, a cultural faith, where the only good is basically harm mitigation. You get these things that are, well, it would be technically by one variant worse if, we banned X, Y, or Z, and it lets us kind of morally justify these obviously like just horrible, practices. Like I'm sure, you've seen what, the kind of people that are in and out of a, a pain clinic, right? Or something like that. And I'm not putting those people down by any means. They're sort of victims of this, right? But or in a, a gas station at a slot machine or something like that, and the idea that this is the compassionate thing to do is sort of something you can only believe if you're completely, ideologically possessed. And I think that ideological possession, that sort of devotion to the, the religion of Moloch, whatever you want to call this, thing we're up against. I mean, it does, very, very clearly produce these horrible results. Like the experiment has been tried. And I think that, I don't know, at least going forward, that's why it's important to get out, to whatever degree you can, because, we've seen what happens when they get in control, the programs that they run, and, their dominance isn't going away nicely. They seem to be willing to kind of, go down with the ship and take as many people as they can with them. So anyway, maybe that's more of a blackpilling note that I wanted to end on.
No, it's I think the only way that I can frame it that's helped make sense for me is that they'd rather be seen doing something that gives them the status of being the provider of empathy. They're the highest status that they can kind of aggregate from the system is that they're the one that's doling out the harm mitigation. If you yourself are someone that's in pain and you find a way to solve it, then you take away their opportunity to gain those status points and be seen as the benevolent provider. And I think it's a symptom of a lot of things: narcissism, insecurity. And for many of our guys, I think you actively begin to work against those in a manner that is healthy and beneficial to not just yourself, but the people around you, by connecting yourself back into the proper feedback loops. One of which is that entrepreneurship route, which is what kind of got me out of it, right? My stepping out began by basically choosing a different set of feedback loops than what was being offered.
So JD, I think that's a pretty good place to end it. We're running out of time. So do you want to handle both, obviously, our plug, and then also maybe if you could let people know where they can find you and more of your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Check out the link in the description. You'll find all of the services that Axios provides. We provide individualized programming, health and fitness consultation, and we have several different accountability or group-based training programs that could be completely beneficial towards you and your goals. If you want to find out more, feel free to schedule a call. I'd be happy to talk with anybody that wants to know more. And you can find me on Twitter at @full_Sturker and @Axios Fitness Coaching. And yeah, peruse the socials and I'll be there. Always happy to chat.
Actually, I was noticing that you got a sponsorships on Pete's show as well. And so I'm glad to hear that you're doing well. You're appearing on other places. And I know that Pete said that you were able to get him down a pretty significant amount of weight. And I can confirm as well that basically I was able to hit a 2-plate bench, right, because of the Axios coaching, which was a goal that I'd had for a long time. And hopefully you're going to help me hit my my really, really stupid goal for next year, which I won't say on air unless we actually start to make progress towards it, because it is a pretty stupid goal. But anyway, man, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Burden. I appreciate it.
And as far as my links, you guys know where to find me. The show is available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere else the podcasts are found. Next week, we've got some really interesting guests coming on, some bigger accounts, who don't directly talk to these circles, but still some people who are interesting. So be sure to check out that. And if you want to support the show, the best way to do that is the links in the description, where you can head over to my page on Axios, and I'll get a little bit of a kickback for that. Again, not much. I don't expect it, but it helps keep the lights on here. And again, JD, I appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.